History does not always announce its turning points with the crash of thunder or the tremor of an earthquake. Sometimes, the most profound changes begin in silence, with a subtle shift in the air, a hairline crack in the foundation of a world. In the year 78 BC, Rome was such a world. To an outsider, standing on the Capitoline Hill and gazing down upon the sprawling heart of the known world, the Republic would have seemed eternal, invincible. The Forum below, a chaotic, vibrant sea of white togas, was the center of gravity for a dominion that stretched from the sun-scorched plains of Hispania to the ancient lands of Greece. The scent of power was in the air, a mixture of baked bread, open sewers, sacrificial incense, and the sweat of 1,000,000 souls, all striving, scheming, and surviving under the banner of the Senate and people of Rome. But for those who knew where to look, for those who could feel the deep vibrations beneath the marble and cobblestone, the truth was far more terrifying. The Republic was sick. It was afflicted with a disease born of its own triumphs, a rot that had set in at the very core of its identity. The city was a paradox of obscene wealth and desperate poverty, living side by side in a state of simmering tension. On the Palatine Hill, aristocrats lived in opulent villas, their floors decorated with intricate mosaics depicting myths of gods and heroes, their tables groaning under the weight of exotic foods procured from the farthest corners of their empire. They were men who owned vast estates, latifundia, that spanned entire countrysides, worked by armies of slaves captured in distant wars. Their wealth was not merely a measure of comfort, it was a weapon, a tool to purchase influence, to bend the law, and to ensure the perpetuation of their own power. Down in the valleys, crammed into the sprawling, fire-prone tenements known as insula, lived another Rome. This was the Rome of the common man, the plebeian, the citizen whose ancestors had fought and bled to build the Republic. They were the descendants of the hardy farmers who had once formed the backbone of the legions, but their small family farms had long been swallowed up by the great estates of the rich. Driven from their land, they flocked to the city, a tide of displaced humanity seeking work that was scarce and dignity that was scarcer. They were the landless poor, a volatile urban mob whose only remaining power was their vote, a vote that was increasingly for sale to the highest bidder. They subsisted on the grain dole, a state-sponsored handout designed less out of compassion and more out of a pragmatic fear of citywide riots. Their loyalty was not to the abstract ideals of the Republic, but to any politician who promised them bread, land, or the bloody spectacle of the games. The system itself, the hallowed mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, was buckling. It was a political framework designed for a small city-state, now straining to govern a global empire. The Senate, once a council of revered elders and statesmen, was becoming a viper's nest of competing factions, each led by powerful dynasts who saw public office not as a service, but as a stepping stone to personal enrichment and military glory. They were men like Lucullus and Pompey, generals who waged wars on the Republic's frontiers, returning not just with triumphs, but with personal fortunes and private armies whose loyalty was to their commander, not to the Senate. The provinces were the source of this corrupting wealth. Governors were dispatched for short terms, and many viewed their posting as a license to plunder. They extorted the provincials, bled the local economies dry, and returned to Rome laden with enough treasure to buy their way into higher office and live in luxury for the rest of their days. The very concept of justice had become a commodity. The courts were presided over by senators who were easily bribed, ensuring that only the foolishly honest or the politically isolated ever face punishment for their crimes against the state. This was the landscape of a society at war with itself. The social war, a brutal conflict against Rome's own Italian allies, had ended only a decade earlier, leaving deep scars across the peninsula. It was followed by the horrifying civil war between the generals Marius and Sulla. Sulla had marched his legions on Rome itself, an unthinkable act of sacrilege, and had instituted the proscriptions, a legalized campaign of murder. Lists of his political enemies were posted in the Forum, and any man could kill them and claim a reward. The streets had run with the blood of Roman citizens, slaughtered by other Romans. The heads of senators were displayed on the rostra, a grotesque warning to any who dared to oppose the will of a single powerful man. Sulla had tried to turn back the clock, to restore the Senate's authority and reinforce the old ways. But in seizing power through military force, he had created a terrifying precedent. He had shown every ambitious man in Rome the ultimate path to power, a loyal army. He had demonstrated that the legions, once the defenders of the Republic, could be its destroyers. The unspoken rules that had held the state together for 400 years had been shattered. The genie of military autocracy was out of the bottle, and it could not be put back. So as the sun set on the year 78 BC, casting long distorted shadows across the Forum, the cracks were no longer invisible. They were fissures running through every aspect of Roman life, political, social, and military. The air was thick with fear, resentment, and a desperate, hungry ambition. The Republic was a magnificent, hollowed-out tree, its ancient bark still impressive, but its heartwood eaten away from the inside. It was waiting for a storm. It was waiting for an axe. It was waiting for a man with the vision, the ruthlessness, and the audacity to see its decay not as a tragedy, but as the perfect, fertile ground upon which to build a new world in his own image. He was out there, a young man of good family but middling fortune, watching, learning, and waiting for his moment. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. Into this fractured world, a world of aging titans and decaying institutions, stepped a young man who moved with a different energy. He was Gaius Julius Caesar. In an age of rigid tradition and stern, unsmiling patriarchs, Caesar was a shock to the system. He was handsome, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was a fastidious dresser, known for the unconventional way he wore his toga, with a loosely tied belt that became a signature of his nonchalant confidence. The old guard, men like Cato the Younger, looked at him and saw a dandy, a dissolute youth more concerned with fashion and love affairs than the serious business of the state. They saw his charm as a frivolous affectation, and his staggering, ever-present debt as a sign of recklessness. They could not have been more wrong. Every aspect of Caesar's public persona was a carefully crafted tool. His charm was a weapon, disarming his rivals and winning the adoration of the common people. His debts, which would have crushed a lesser man, were a strategic investment. By borrowing enormous sums from powerful men like Marcus Crassus, he bound their fortunes to his own. His success became their success, his failure a financial catastrophe they could not afford. He was a man who understood that in the new Rome, power did not flow from ancestral lands or hoarded gold, but from connection, from popularity, and from the calculated application of audacity. And his lineage? This was perhaps his greatest asset. The Julii were an old patrician family, but not among the most powerful or wealthy of their time. Yet they claimed a heritage that dwarfed all others. They traced their bloodline back to Iulus, the son of the Trojan hero Aeneas, who himself was the son of the goddess Venus. Caesar never let anyone forget it. When he delivered the eulogy for his aunt Julia, the widow of the great general Marius, he broke with all tradition. He spoke not only of her, but of their divine ancestry, publicly linking his family to the very gods of Rome.
To his enemies in the Senate, it was an act of breathtaking arrogance. To the people in the streets, it was electrifying. Here was a man who did not just walk among them, but who claimed a connection to the heavens. He had learned from the brutal lessons of the recent past. As a young man, his connection by marriage to the Marian faction had put him on Sulla's proscription lists. He was hunted, forced to flee the city and go into hiding, his life forfeit. He was eventually captured and only secured his survival by bribing his captors and through the intervention of powerful family friends. When they pleaded for his life, Sulla had reluctantly agreed, but with a chilling prophecy. "In this boy," Sulla warned them, "I see many Mariuses." He saw the same boundless ambition, the same populist appeal, the same potential to overturn the established order. Sulla saw the predator hiding behind the charming smile. This experience did not break Caesar, it forged him. It taught him that the political arena was a blood sport, that mercy was a weakness, and that true security lay only in absolute power. He spent his early years away from Rome, serving with distinction in the military in the East. He proved his courage, winning the civic crown, Rome's second highest military honor, for saving the life of a fellow citizen in battle. But he was also captured by pirates in the Aegean Sea, an event that became a defining story of his character. Held for ransom, he was not a terrified victim. He was indignant at the low sum they demanded, insisting they asked for more, a price more befitting his station. For weeks, he lived among them not as a prisoner, but as a commander. He wrote speeches and poems and forced the pirates to listen to them. He joined in their games, and he laughingly promised them that one day he would return and have them all crucified. Their captors thought it was a joke. It was not. As soon as his ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar raised a small naval force, hunted down the pirates, captured them, and, making good on his promise, had them all executed. The story spread like wildfire. It was a perfect encapsulation of the man, audacious, utterly fearless, and possessed of a will as cold and hard as iron. Upon his return to Rome, he began his slow, methodical climb up the cursus honorum, the traditional sequence of political offices. He started as a military tribune, then a quaestor, but it was as an aedile that he truly announced his arrival. The aediles were responsible for public works and games, and Caesar used the position to put on the most lavish, spectacular gladiatorial contests the city had ever seen, funded by yet more borrowed money. The people roared his name in the Colosseum. He was giving them the bread and circuses they craved, and they loved him for it. He also restored the public monuments to his uncle Marius, which Sulla had torn down. It was a direct challenge to the Sullan establishment, a signal that a new power was rising from the ashes of the old Marian faction. He saw the Republic's decay with perfect clarity. He looked at the corrupt Senate, the impoverished masses, the overmighty generals, and the failing institutions, and he did not see a crisis to be managed. He saw a vacuum. He saw a system so brittle and rotten that a man of sufficient will could shatter it and remold it. The old ways were dying. Honor was a pretense. Law was a tool for the rich, and tradition was a cage. Caesar had no intention of being caged. He was the young lion, patient and watchful, learning the weaknesses of the herd. He would play their game, but by his own rules, until he was strong enough to stop playing altogether.
In the year 60 BC, the Roman Republic was a stage dominated by three men, each a giant in his own right, each possessed of a power that the state could no longer contain. They were rivals, their ambitions naturally placing them on a collision course. The political calculus of the time suggested they would inevitably clash, tearing the Republic apart in their struggle for supremacy. But Gaius Julius Caesar, the master of the unconventional, saw a different path. He understood a fundamental truth of power. When you cannot defeat your rivals, you must bind them to you. What followed was not a public declaration or a treaty signed in the Senate House, but a conspiracy, a secret pact forged in backrooms and whispered conversations, a conspiracy that would effectively hijack the Roman state. This was the birth of the first triumvirate. The first pillar of this secret alliance was Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great. He was the Republic's most celebrated military hero, a man who had been granted a triumph while still in his 20s, before he had even held a formal magistracy. His career was a string of dazzling successes. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in a lightning campaign, pacified Spain, and, most recently, had marched east, conquering vast new territories, defeating the legendary Mithridates of Pontus, and reorganizing the entire political map of the Roman East. He returned to Rome not just as a general, but as a living legend, expecting the Senate to shower him with honors, ratify his eastern settlements, and grant his veteran soldiers the land they had been promised. But the Senate, steeped in paranoia and led by rigid conservatives like Cato, feared him. They saw in Pompey another Sulla, another general whose popularity and military might could eclipse their own authority. And so, they deliberately humiliated him. They stalled, debated, and refused to ratify his acts. They denied his soldiers their land. Pompey, the conqueror of the East, found himself politically impotent in the heart of Rome. His prestige wounded, his promises to his men broken. He was a titan entangled in the webs of petty politics, and he was furious. The second pillar was Marcus Licinius Crassus. If Pompey's power came from military glory, Crassus came from money. He was, by a vast margin, the wealthiest man in Rome, and perhaps in its history. He had built his colossal fortune from the ashes of the sullen proscriptions, buying up the confiscated properties of the condemned for a fraction of their worth. He owned vast tracts of the city, and his infamous fire brigade would rush to the scene of a blaze, only to begin negotiating the purchase of the burning building from its desperate owner. He was a master of debt, a spider at the center of a financial web that extended throughout the Roman elite. Many senators were in his debt. Caesar himself was one of his biggest borrowers. But for all his wealth, Crassus craved something money could not buy: military prestige. He had brutally crushed the slave revolt of Spartacus, lining the Appian Way with 6,000 crucified slaves, but the Senate had awarded the true glory of that victory to Pompey, who had arrived at the last minute to mop up the remnants. The slight had festered for years. Crassus despised Pompey, and the feeling was mutual. And then there was Caesar. He was the catalyst, the political genius who saw the potential in this toxic stalemate. He had just returned from his governorship in Spain, where he had waged a successful military campaign and amassed enough personal wealth to finally begin paying down his monumental debts. He was ready to run for the highest office, the consulship. But the Senate, his sworn enemies, stood in his way. They presented him with a procedural trap. To be eligible for a triumph for his victories in Spain, he had to remain outside the city walls as a military commander. But to formally declare his candidacy for consul, he had to enter the city as a private citizen. He could not do both. Forced to choose, he relinquished his triumph, a sacrifice that stunned his contemporaries,
and entered the city to stand for election. He knew the consulship was the greater prize. It was in this moment that Caesar approached his two great rivals. To Pompey he made a simple, powerful offer. The Senate has scorned you. They will never give your soldiers their land or ratify your settlements, but I can. Elect me as consul, and I will use the power of the office to force your agenda through the popular assemblies, bypassing the Senate entirely. To Crassus, the man who held his debts, he offered a similar proposition. Crassus's key political allies, the tax-farming Equites, were demanding a renegotiation of their contracts in Asia, a demand the Senate had arrogantly refused. Support me, just Caesar would have said, and I will deliver for your allies. Your power is in wealth, but I can translate that wealth into political action you desire. And to both men, he delivered the masterstroke. You both despise each other, he would have reasoned, and as long as you remain enemies, the Senate will play you off against one another, and you will both be diminished. But what if we were to unite? What if the three of us, your military glory, your bottomless wealth, and my popular support were to form a single, unbreakable block? There is nothing we could not achieve. Any law we wished to pass, we could pass. Any enemy who stood against us, we could crush. We will not be three rivals fighting for scraps from the Senate's table. We will be the table. It was a pact born of pure pragmatism, a monstrous alliance of convenience. They swore an oath that no action would be taken in the Republic that was displeasing to any of the three. It was, in effect, a private government, a triumvirate of three men who would rule Rome from the shadows. The Republic's constitution, its traditions, its very soul, were now subject to the whims of this secret committee. The cracks in the foundation had given way. The structure was now held together only by the shared ambition of three men who had decided that Rome was no longer their master, but their prize. The grab for power had begun in earnest.
The year 59 BC dawned over Rome like any other, but it would be a year like no other. It was the year of the consulship of Julius and Caesar. This was the bitter joke that began to circulate in the taverns and bathhouses of the city. For while Rome had two consuls, as tradition demanded, one of them was so completely and utterly neutralized that he ceased to exist as a political force. The year belonged to one man alone. This was Caesar's first taste of supreme executive power, and he wielded it not like a scalpel, but like a bludgeon. The careful, charming ascent was over. The time for raw, unapologetic force had arrived. His consular colleague was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a staunch conservative and a son-in-law of Cato the Younger. He was the Senate's man, placed in office to be a brake on Caesar's ambition, a living veto on any radical proposals. The Optimates, the aristocratic faction in the Senate, believed the system would hold. They believed that one consul could always block the other, that the ancient traditions would hamstring this upstart. They had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man they were dealing with and the new power he represented. Caesar's first act was to propose his land reform bill, the Lex Agraria. On the surface, it was a classic populist measure, a proposal to redistribute public lands in Italy to Pompey's demobilized veterans and to the urban poor of Rome. It was the fulfillment of his promise to Pompey and a direct appeal to the masses. He presented it first to the Senate, a gesture of respect for tradition that was, in reality, a calculated trap. He knew they would reject it. Cato and his allies rose to speak, launching into furious tirades against the bill,
denouncing it as a giveaway, a bribe, a dangerous step towards tyranny. They used every procedural trick they knew, filibustering for hours on end to prevent a vote. Caesar listened with a show of theatrical patience. Then, seeing the Senate would not yield, he declared that he was being forced, against his will, to take the matter to the people. He strode out of the Curia and into the Forum, where the popular assembly was gathered. Here, he was not a magistrate seeking counsel. He was a commander addressing his troops. He brought Pompey and Crassus before the crowd, forcing them to publicly declare their support for the bill, revealing the triumvirate's power for all to see. The message was clear. The three most powerful men in Rome were united behind this law. Bibulus, however, would not be broken. He and his supporters tried to have their say in the Forum. They were shouted down. As Bibulus attempted to interpose his veto, the scene descended into chaos. A brawl erupted. The crowd, whipped into a frenzy by Caesar's agents, surged forward. Bibulus was assaulted. Filth and excrement were hurled at him. His fasces, the sacred symbols of his consular authority, were smashed to pieces on the ground. Terrified and humiliated, he was driven from the Forum and forced to flee for his life. It was a moment of profound and shocking violence. A duly elected consul of Rome had been physically attacked and chased from the center of public life by a mob while his colleagues stood by and watched. The unspoken rules of the Republic had been shattered in daylight. From that day forward, Bibulus did not dare to show his face in the Forum again. He locked himself in his house for the remainder of the year, issuing a stream of edicts declaring Caesar's laws to be invalid on religious grounds, claiming he had seen unfavorable omens in the sky. No one listened. Caesar simply ignored him. With Bibulus effectively under house arrest, Caesar governed as an autocrat. He pushed his land bill through the assembly. He forced through the ratification of Pompey's eastern settlements. He delivered the tax breaks for Crassus's allies. Law after law was passed, not with the consent of the Senate, but by the will of one man, backed by the threat of mob violence and the immense shadow of Pompey's veterans lingering in the city. The Senate was rendered completely impotent, its authority a hollow fiction. Cato and other opponents were threatened with imprisonment and violence if they dared to speak out. This was a year of political revolution disguised as a consulship. Caesar was systematically dismantling the authority of the Senate and transferring it to the popular assemblies which he controlled. He passed a law requiring all senators to swear a personal oath to uphold his land reform on pain of exile. It was a humiliating act of submission, forcing his enemies to personally endorse the very measures they had fought against. Men like Cato initially refused, but faced with the prospect of political oblivion, they were eventually forced to relent. Caesar was making enemies, powerful, bitter enemies who would never forgive him for the humiliations of this year. He was burning every bridge that connected him to the traditional power structure of the Republic, but he did not care. He was securing his future. The final and most crucial piece of legislation he passed during his consulship was one that concerned himself. He had the assembly grant him a 5-year proconsular command, not over some peaceful, prestigious province, but over Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum, a vast swathe of territory on the edge of the Roman world. And most importantly, it came with an army of 4 legions. This was his endgame. He knew that when his year as consul ended, he would be a private citizen, and his enemies would descend on him with a torrent of lawsuits and prosecutions for his illegal acts. His immunity from prosecution depended on him holding public office. The governorship of Gaul was his shield. The legions were his sword. He had used his first taste of supreme power not just to reward his allies and build his popular support, but to forge for himself an escape route, and the power base from which he could launch the next and far more bloody phase of his ambition. As the year 59 BC came to a close, Caesar prepared to leave Rome. He had broken the city's political system to his will. Now he would go and forge an army in his own image, an army that would one day return to finish what he had started.
In the spring of 58 BC, Gaius Julius Caesar turned his back on the seething political cauldron of Rome and rode north. He left behind the marble halls of the Senate, the chaotic energy of the Forum, and the bitter hatred of his enemies. He was trading the politician's toga for the general's scarlet cloak, the palumentum. For many Roman aristocrats, a provincial governorship was a brief, unpleasant duty, a chance to enrich oneself before returning to the civilized comforts of the capital. For Caesar, it was not an interlude. It was the entire purpose of the game. Rome had given him the legal authority, the imperium, but true power, the kind that could not be stripped away by a lawsuit or a political vote, did not grow in the Forum. It grew in the harsh, unforgiving soil of the military camp. He arrived in Gaul to take command of his 4 legions, perhaps 20,000 men. They were not yet his legions, not in the way that mattered. They were soldiers of the Republic, professional fighting men, but their primary loyalty was to the abstract idea of the state and to the immediate reality of their paycheck. Caesar knew this was not enough. The army he needed, the army that could one day march on Rome itself if necessary, had to be bound to him by something stronger than pay and patriotism. It had to be bound by a bond of personal devotion, a fanatical loyalty forged in shared hardship and shared victory. He was not just taking command of an army. He was setting out to create a living weapon with himself as its heart and mind. His methods were revolutionary. Roman generals of the old school, like Pompey, often maintained a dignified distance from their men. They were commanders, not comrades. Caesar shattered this tradition. From the moment he arrived, he immersed himself in the life of the common soldier. He rejected the luxuries to which his rank entitled him. There were no lavish litters to carry him on the march. He rode his horse alongside his men, or, more often, he walked. He disdained special rations, preferring to eat the same coarse bread, hard cheese, and sour wine that sustained the lowest-ranking legionary. He slept in the open, under a simple soldier's cloak, sharing the same cold ground and the same star-filled sky. This was not an act. The soldiers could sense the difference between a politician's empty gesture and genuine shared experience. They saw him shivering in the same pre-dawn chill, his face caked with the same dust from the road, his muscles aching from the same grueling pace of the march. The Roman legionary's life was one of relentless, back-breaking labor. A soldier was not just a fighter. He was a manual laborer, an engineer, a construction worker. Every night on the march, in hostile territory, they would build a fully fortified camp from scratch, a miniature city complete with ditches, ramparts, and palisades. Caesar was there, overseeing the work, offering encouragement, driving them on not with the lash of a whip, but with his own tireless example. He possessed an almost supernatural memory for names. He made it his business to know his centurions, the hardened professional backbone of the army. He knew their histories, their families, their deeds of valor. In a force of thousands, to be addressed by name by the commanding general was an electrifying experience. It transformed a soldier from an anonymous cog in a vast machine into a man who was seen, who was known, who mattered. He would walk the lines before a battle, not delivering grand abstract speeches about the glory of Rome, but speaking to individual soldiers. You, Marcus, I remember your courage at the river crossing. Show me that courage again today. Gaius, your brother wrote to me of your new son. Fight today so that you may one day tell him of this victory. He was famously generous with the spoils of war. While he amassed a colossal personal fortune from his campaigns, he ensured his soldiers shared in the wealth. The bonuses he paid were legendary, far exceeding the standard pay from the state. He understood that while men might fight for honor, they died for it more willingly if their families were provided for. But he also rewarded another, more valuable currency: glory. He was meticulous in recognizing and promoting courage. A soldier who showed exceptional bravery could be promoted on the spot, his deeds recorded and read out to the entire legion. He created a culture where valor was the highest virtue, and every man, from the rawest recruit to the most grizzled veteran, knew that his general's eye was upon them. But his connection with them went deeper than shared hardship and shared rewards. He cultivated a sense of us against the world. He was their champion. When the Senate tried to interfere, to question his command or deny his requests for reinforcements, Caesar made sure his soldiers knew it. He framed it as an insult not just to him, but to them. The politicians in Rome, he implied, did not respect their sacrifices, their victories, their spilled blood. It was Caesar, their commander, who fought for them, both on the battlefield and in the political arena. He was their patron, their father figure, their leader. Over months that stretched into years, a profound transformation took place. The legions in Gaul ceased to be merely units of the Roman army. They became Caesar's legions. Their identity became intertwined with his. The eagle standards they carried, the sacred symbols of Rome, became secondary to the personal allegiance they felt for the man who led them. They were no longer fighting for the Senate and people of Rome. They were fighting for Caesar. They were a family, a tribe, a cult of personality forged in the crucible of war. He was building more than an army. He was building a key, and when the time came, he would use it to unlock the gates of Rome.
Caesar's proconsular command was not a peaceful sinecure. It was a license to wage war. The justification for his presence, the legal pretext for the violence that was to come, arrived almost immediately. A vast migration was underway. The Helvetii, a powerful confederation of Gallic tribes living in the mountains of modern-day Switzerland, had decided to abandon their homeland. Driven by pressure from aggressive Germanic tribes to their north and the desire for more fertile lands, they burned their villages and towns, some 400 of them, in a dramatic, irreversible act of commitment. Their plan was to trek across Roman territory and settle near the Atlantic coast. An entire nation, hundreds of thousands of people, including warriors, women, and children, was on the move. For Caesar, this was not a refugee crisis. It was the perfect opportunity, the casus belli he desperately needed. A mass migration of this scale would destabilize the entire region, threatening Roman allies and providing a pretext for military intervention. He moved with lightning speed. When the Helvetii envoys requested permission to cross the Roman province, he stalled them, using the time to fortify the banks of the Rhone River, building a 19-mile-long wall and a series of forts to block their path. Denied passage, the Helvetii were forced to take a longer, more difficult route north, through the lands of Roman-allied Gallic tribes. This was all the justification Caesar required. Claiming he was defending Rome's allies from the depredations of the migrating horde, he marched his legions out of their camps. The war for Gaul had begun. The first encounters were a brutal education in the nature of Roman warfare for the tribes of Gaul. The Gauls were fierce, brave, and individualistic warriors. They fought with wild courage, their leaders often clad in brightly colored cloaks and horned helmets, seeking personal glory in single combat. They would charge in a great, screaming wave of humanity, a terrifying sight and sound, relying on shock and momentum to break their enemy's line. Against the Roman legion, this courage was tragically insufficient. The legion was not an army of individual heroes. It was a disciplined, professional killing machine. As the Gallic warriors charged, they were met not with a fragile line of men, but with a wall of towering shields, the scuta. From behind this wall, the legionaries would unleash a series of devastating volleys. The first was a shower of heavy javelins, the pila. These were ingeniously designed weapons. Their long, soft iron shanks would bend upon impact, making them impossible to pull out and throw back.
A Gallic warrior would find his shield suddenly encumbered by a heavy dangling shaft of metal, rendering it useless. He would be forced to discard it, facing the next stage of the Roman assault, unprotected. After the javelins came the methodical, grinding work of the sword. The Roman line would open, and the legionaries would step forward, a human meat grinder. They did not swing their short swords, the gladius, in wide, heroic arcs. They were trained to make short, economical, brutal thrusts into the gut and face of the man in front of them. It was close, horrifying, industrial-scale slaughter. The legionaries fought in a system of rotation. As the men in the front line tired, they would fall back, and a fresh line would step forward to continue the butchery. The campaign against the Helvetii culminated in the Battle of Bibracte. After a long and grueling pursuit, Caesar finally forced the migrants into a decisive engagement. The battle raged for hours, a desperate struggle between the wild courage of the Gauls and the cold, disciplined efficiency of the legions. By nightfall, the Helvetii were broken. The aftermath was a vision of hell. The battlefield was a carpet of dead and dying. But the horror was not over. Caesar's legions stormed the makeshift camp where the Helvetii had gathered their wagons, their families, and their possessions. The slaughter continued into the night, as the soldiers cut down not just the remaining warriors, but women and children who stood in their way. In the end, their survivors were rounded up. Of nearly 370,000 people who had begun the migration, Caesar's own records claimed that only 110,000 remained. He did not enslave them. In a cold, strategic calculation, he ordered them to return to their burned-out homes. He needed them to act as a buffer, to reoccupy the land and guard the frontier against the even greater threat of the Germanic tribes. They were sent back with nothing, a broken people, a living testament to the cost of defying Roman will. This first campaign set the tone for the next 9 years. It was a cycle of provocation, brutal suppression, and strategic calculation. Caesar would use the request of one allied tribe to justify an attack on another. He would present himself as a defender, a peacekeeper, a bringer of Roman order, all while systematically dismantling the independence of every tribe he encountered. The fires of war once lit began to spread across the entirety of Gaul. Each victory brought him more wealth, more slaves to sell, and most importantly, it hardened his legions. With every battle they became more experienced, more ruthless, more devoted to the general who led them to victory after victory. The conquest of Gaul was underway, a brutal and bloody process that would consume a generation of Gallic warriors and transform Caesar from merely a politician to the greatest military commander of his age.
In the summer of 55 BC, 2 years into his campaigns, Caesar had pushed the boundaries of Roman power to the very edge of the known world. He had subdued Gallic tribes and driven back Germanic invaders. He now stood on the western bank of the Rhine, a wide, deep, and fast-flowing river that marked a profound psychological and geographical boundary. On his side lay the world of Gaul, a land being brutally hammered into the shape of a Roman province. On the other side lay the dark, sprawling, and mysterious forests of Germania. It was a realm of myth and fear for the Romans, a land of savage, giant-limbed warriors who represented a primal chaos that stood in stark opposition to Roman order. Germanic tribes, the Usipetes and Tencteri, had recently crossed the river, clashing with Gallic tribes and threatening the stability Caesar was imposing. He had met them in battle, and, in an act of chillingly ambiguous morality, had slaughtered them, not just the warriors, but the entire migrating people, including their women and children who had come to his camp under a flag of truce to negotiate. He had eliminated the immediate threat, but he knew the incursions would continue. The Rhine was a porous border, and as long as the Germanic tribes believed they could cross it, raid, and retreat to safety, Gaul would never be secure.
A conventional Roman general would have been content with driving the enemy back across the river. He would have established the defensive line, built forts, and patrolled the banks. But Caesar was not a conventional general. He was a master of political theater, a man who understood that power was not just about winning battles, but about creating an aura of limitless capability. He decided it was not enough to defeat the Germans. He had to stun them. He had to demonstrate, in the most dramatic way imaginable, that no barrier, not even a mighty river, could place them beyond the reach of Roman power. He decided to cross the Rhine. He would not cross it in boats. Ferries and transports were for raiding parties, for temporary incursions. A crossing in boats would signal a temporary presence. Caesar wanted to send a message of permanence, of dominion. He would march his legions across the river as if it were solid ground. He would build a bridge. The very idea was an act of supreme audacity. The Rhine at that point was over a quarter of a mile wide. Its current was powerful, and its depth was uncertain. His own engineers, masters of Roman military construction, were daunted by the scale and difficulty of the task. But Caesar was adamant. He sketched out the design himself, a testament to his own formidable skills as an engineer. It was not to be a simple floating pontoon bridge, but a massive, deep-driven trestle bridge, a structure of immense strength and stability, designed to withstand the full force of the river's current. The work began immediately. The legions, the same men who were masters of the sword and javelin, now became an army of lumberjacks and carpenters. They ventured into the surrounding forests, felling huge trees. The design was ingenious. Great timber piles, sharpened to a point, were driven into the riverbed. They were not driven in vertically, but at an angle, leaning against the current. Facing them, another set of piles was driven in, angled with the current. These two opposing sets were then joined by a massive 2-foot-thick transverse beam, locking them together into a powerful A-frame structure that used the river's own force to press the joints more tightly together. The sound of the work was thunderous, a constant percussive roar that echoed for miles. Thousands of men worked in a disciplined, relentless rhythm. Huge pile drivers, operated by teams of legionaries, hoisted massive weights and sent them crashing down, driving the timber beams deep into the mud and gravel of the riverbed. The blows fell day and night. It was a spectacle of organized, overwhelming force, a war waged not against an army, but against nature itself. The dramatic tribes who had gathered on the far bank to watch were mesmerized. At first they may have scoffed at the attempt, but as the structure began to creep out from the Roman bank, a steady, inexorable advance into the heart of the river, their mockery must have turned to disbelief, and then to awe, and finally to a deep, primal fear. They were witnessing something that was beyond their comprehension. This was not the work of men. It was the work of gods or demons. It was the physical manifestation of a will that could bend rivers and move mountains. In just 10 days, the bridge was complete. A marvel of engineering, a wooden highway stretching over 400 meters across one of Europe's great rivers, strong enough to support the weight of tens of thousands of heavily armed men marching in formation. Caesar then led his legions across the river. The psychological impact was devastating. He had done the impossible. He had erased the boundary that had protected the Germanic tribes for centuries. He did not fight a major battle. He didn't need to. The tribes that had dared to challenge him had already fled deep into the forests. Caesar marched his army into their territory, burned a few of their villages, and accepted the submissions of those tribes who now rushed to offer him hostages and declare their friendship. He remained in Germania for only 18 days. He had made his point. Then he marched his legions back across his bridge and, as a final dramatic statement, had the entire structure dismantled behind him. The bridge was never intended to be a permanent fixture. Its purpose was purely psychological. It was a symbol, a piece of propaganda written in timber and iron. The message was sent not just to the tribes of Germania, but to his allies in Gaul, and, most importantly, to his rivals back in Rome. It was a declaration of his power, a demonstration that for Gaius Julius Caesar and his legions, nothing was impossible. The story of the bridge over the Rhine would become legend, a testament to the terrifying ambition and ingenuity of the man who was no longer just a governor, but a force of nature in his own right.
Having tamed a river and terrified the peoples of Germania, Caesar's restless ambition sought a new stage. His gaze turned north, across the churning waters of the Channel, to a land that existed only on the very fringe of the Roman imagination, the island of Britannia. To the Romans, Britain was a place of myth, a mysterious, fog-shrouded island at the end of the world. Rumors and tall tales were the only sources of information. It was said to be a land of savage, blue-painted warriors, of strange, druidic cults who practiced human sacrifice in dark groves, and, most tantalizingly, of pearls, gold, and tin. No Roman army had ever set foot on its shores. Caesar's official justification for the expedition was, as always, strategic. He claimed that warriors from Britannia had been crossing the Channel to aid the Gauls in their resistance against him. To secure Gaul, he argued, he must neutralize this source of enemy support. But his true motives were far more personal and far more theatrical. The conquest of Gaul was a monumental achievement, but it was a war on a known frontier. An invasion of Britannia was a leap into the unknown, a journey beyond the map. It was an expedition that would capture the imagination of the people back in Rome, an act of unparalleled daring that would elevate his name into the realm of legendary explorers and conquerors. This was not a campaign for territory. It was a campaign for glory, for dignitas, for a story that would echo through eternity. In the late summer of 55 BC, shortly after his German expedition, Caesar gathered a fleet of around 80 transport ships and 2 legions, the 7th and the famed 10th. It was a reconnaissance in force, a preliminary probe into this mysterious land. The crossing itself was fraught with difficulty. The tides and currents of the Channel were unlike anything the Roman sailors, accustomed to the placid Mediterranean, had ever experienced. But the true challenge came when they reached the British coast. The white cliffs of Dover rose before them, and lining the cliff tops were thousands of British warriors. They stood silhouetted against the sky, a terrifying spectacle of armed men, their shouts and war cries carrying across the water. To attempt a landing there, with his men having to scale the cliffs in the face of such opposition, would be suicide. Caesar sailed a few miles further down the coast, finding a flat, open beach. But the Britons, their forces including cavalry and terrifying war chariots, had shadowed his fleet's movement and were waiting for them on the shore. The Roman ships, with their deep draft, could not get close enough to the beach. The legionaries, laden with over 60 pounds of armor, weapons, and equipment, were ordered to disembark into chest-deep, cold, churning water. They hesitated. Before them was a chaotic, churning sea. Beyond that, a beach swarming with screaming enemies hurling javelins and stones. For a moment, the entire invasion hung on the balance. The men, unnerved by the strange new enemy and the treacherous water, refused to move. It was a moment that called for a hero, and one emerged. He was the Aquilifer, the eagle-bearer of the 10th Legion, a man whose name history has not recorded, but whose actions saved the day. The eagle standard he carried was the most sacred object in the Legion, the physical embodiment of its honor and its soul. To lose it was the ultimate disgrace. Seeing the hesitation of his comrades, the Aquilifer shouted in a loud voice for all to hear, "Leap down, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray your eagle to the enemy. I, for my part, will have done my duty to the Republic and to my general." With that, he leaped from the ship, holding the golden eagle high,
and began to wade alone toward the enemy-held shore. It was an act of incredible, almost suicidal bravery. Shamed by his courage and terrified at the thought of their sacred eagle falling into enemy hands, the soldiers of the 10th Legion surged out of the ships after him. A chaotic, desperate battle erupted in the surf. Men struggled to keep their footing in the waves, weighed down by their armor, fighting against a mobile and ferocious enemy. It was a confused, bloody melee, a struggle for a foothold on the edge of the world. Slowly, painstakingly, the discipline of the legions began to tell. Once they established a solid line on the beach, they were able to form up and push the Britons back. A precarious beachhead was secured. But Caesar's troubles were far from over. A few days later, a powerful storm swept in from the Atlantic. It smashed into his fleet, wrecking the warships he had beached and scattering the transport ships that were bringing his cavalry. He was now stranded in a hostile, unknown land, with a damaged fleet, no cavalry, and dwindling supplies as winter approached. The Britons, seeing the Romans' predicament, regrouped and launched a series of attacks. They revealed their most fearsome weapon, the war chariot. This was a form of warfare utterly alien to the Romans. The chariots would race across the battlefield at terrific speed, the warriors on board hurling javelins into the Roman ranks. Then, the driver would expertly control the horses while the warrior dismounted to fight on foot, ready to leap back onto the chariot and speed away in an instant. It was a fluid, unnerving style of fighting that combined the shock of cavalry with the stability of infantry. The Roman legions, though battered and unnerved, held their ground. He managed to repair a portion of his fleet, just enough to carry his army back to Gaul. He had not conquered any territory. He had not won a decisive victory. By any conventional military measure, the expedition was a failure. But Caesar, the master of propaganda, knew how to spin the story. He had not failed. He had dared. He had led a Roman army where no one had gone before. He had fought strange blue-painted warriors and their terrifying chariots. He had survived the wrath of the ocean itself. When his dispatches reached Rome, the city was electrified. The Senate, despite their hatred for him, were forced to vote him a supplicatio, a public thanksgiving of 20 days, an unprecedented honor. The common people were enthralled. Caesar was no longer just a general. He was an adventurer, a hero from the pages of myth, a man who had literally stepped off the edge of the known world. He had not brought back gold or pearls, but he had brought back a legend. And in the political landscape of Rome, a legend was worth far more.
The year 520 BC began with the taste of ash and blood. Caesar's expeditions to Britannia and Germania had been spectacular theater, but while the star performer was away, the stage she had left behind had begun to smolder. The brutal, piecemeal conquest of Gaul had sown the land with the seeds of a deep and bitter hatred. For 6 years, the Gallic tribes had been played off against one another, their lands ravaged, their people enslaved, their sacred groves desecrated. Now, that simmering resentment was about to erupt into a single, unified conflagration. The Great Rebellion had begun. At the heart of the storm was a new kind of enemy, a young chieftain of the Arverni tribe named Vercingetorix. He was not like the old Gallic leaders Caesar had so easily defeated. He was intelligent, charismatic, and he understood the futility of facing the Roman legions in a pitched battle. He preached a new, terrifying strategy, a scorched earth policy. He urged the tribes to burn their own towns, their own farms, their own grain stores. They would create a wasteland, a fiery desert, and deny the Roman army the supplies it needed to survive. The legions, he argued, could not eat iron and steel. They would starve, their strength would wither, and then they could be destroyed. It was a brutal, desperate strategy,
and it required an almost unimaginable sacrifice from the Gallic people. But their hatred for Rome was now so profound that they agreed. A wave of fire swept across central Gaul as the tribes began to systematically destroy their own livelihoods. Town after town was put to the torch, but when the council of chieftains came to the city of Avaricum, the capital of the Bituriges tribe, its people fell to their knees and begged for it to be spared. Avaricum was one of the most beautiful and well-fortified cities in all of Gaul. It sat in a naturally defensible position, surrounded on almost all sides by rivers and marshland, accessible by only a single, narrow causeway. Its defenses were so strong it could never be taken. Reluctantly, against his own better judgment, Vercingetorix agreed. He would station his main army nearby to harass the Romans and cut off their foraging parties, while the city prepared to withstand a siege. It was a fateful, catastrophic mistake. Caesar, his army already feeling the pangs of hunger from the scorched earth campaign, saw Avaricum not as an obstacle, but as a lifeline. Within its walls lay the grain stores he desperately needed. He marched his legions to the city, and the grim, methodical work of a Roman siege began. The scene was one of monumental, almost insane industry. The single narrow approach to the city became a massive construction site. Thousands of legionaries, working day and night under the constant harassment of Gallic skirmishers, began to build. They constructed 2 enormous siege towers, wooden monstrosities that slowly grew to rival the height of the city walls. They built a vast earthen ramp, a sloping causeway of timber and soil, 330 feet wide and 80 feet high, that would allow them to roll their towers and battering rams right up to the enemy's fortifications. The Gauls, who were skilled miners, dug tunnels beneath the ramp, attempting to collapse it from below. The Romans countermined, and vicious, desperate battles were fought in the darkness, hundreds of feet underground. The Gauls sallied from their gates at night, attempting to set fire to the Roman siege works. The air was filled with the constant rain of arrows, sling stones, and javelins. For 27 days, this grim contest of engineering and endurance continued. The Roman soldiers were starving. Their grain supplies were exhausted. They were reduced to foraging for roots in the fields and slaughtering their own cattle for meat. The men were weak, but their discipline held, their resolve hardened by Caesar's own unyielding presence. He moved among them constantly, refusing any personal comfort, sharing their meager rations, his own will of force that kept the entire enterprise from collapsing. The Gallic defenders were equally determined. Caesar himself, in his commentaries, pays grudging respect to their ingenuity and courage. They used grappling hooks to catch the Roman rams and winches to hoist them up and away from the walls. They smothered the heads of the rams with fire-retardant hides. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their very existence, and they fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. The end came during a torrential downpour. The rain drove the Gallic sentries to seek shelter. Seeing his opportunity, Caesar ordered the final assault. The siege towers, which had been damaged and repaired countless times, were rolled forward. The legionaries swarmed up the ladders and onto the earthen ramp. They poured over the walls, a relentless tide of steel and fury. What followed was not a battle. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. The Roman soldiers, embittered by the long and brutal siege, maddened by hunger, and enraged by the losses they had suffered, were given no order to show mercy. They slaughtered everyone they could find. They cut down the armed defenders, But they did not stop there. They hunted through the streets and houses, killing the elderly, the women, the children. The beautiful city of Avaricum became a charnel house, its streets running with blood, its air thick with the screams of the dying and the smoke of burning buildings. Of the 40,000 inhabitants who had resided within the city walls, Caesar records that only 800 managed to escape and make their way to Vercingetorix's camp. They were the only survivors, living ghosts who brought with them the horrifying tale of the city's end. The fall of Avaricum was a chilling demonstration of Roman ruthlessness. It provided Caesar's army with the grain it needed to continue the campaign, but it also filled the hearts of the Gauls with a cold, murderous rage. The war was no longer about independence. It had become a war of annihilation.
Fresh from the brutal victory at Avaricum, his legions' bellies finally full of captured grain, Caesar's aura of invincibility seemed absolute. He had met the great Gallic rebellion, weathered its scorched earth strategy, and answered with an act of annihilating force. He now sought to press his advantage and deliver the killing blow. He divided his army, sending 4 legions north under his trusted lieutenant Labanus to suppress rebellious tribes, while he himself took the remaining 6 legions and marched south into the heart of enemy territory. His target was Gergovia, the mountain stronghold of the Arverni, Vercingetorix's own people. Gergovia was not like Avaricum. It was a fortress built by nature, a high, sprawling plateau with steep, treacherous slopes on all sides. Vercingetorix, having learned the terrible lesson of Avaricum, had no intention of allowing himself to be trapped within its walls. He established his main camp on the high ground, his forces arrayed across the slopes, protected by a hastily constructed stone wall. He controlled all the approaches and, crucially, the primary source of water. To take Gergovia would not just be a matter of engineering, it would require dislodging a massive, well-positioned army from a nearly impregnable mountain. Caesar, arriving at the foot of the great plateau, recognized the impossibility of a direct frontal assault. The risk was too great, the potential for catastrophic losses too high. He settled in for another siege, but this was a siege of a different kind. He could not encircle the entire mountain. Instead, he began a campaign of strategic positioning. His legions captured a smaller outlying hill that commanded a position near the Gallic water supply, cutting it off and forcing the defenders to rely on a smaller, less accessible stream. He began constructing a massive set of parallel trenches, a fortified corridor that would allow his troops to move from their main camp to the newly captured hill without being exposed to enemy fire. The campaign settled into a tense stalemate, but as the days wore on, Caesar's position began to deteriorate. His allied Gallic cavalry, the Aedui, who had been a cornerstone of his Gallic campaigns, began to waver. Vercingetorix's agents had infiltrated their ranks, spreading rumors and appealing to their sense of Gallic brotherhood. A contingent of Aeduan troops, marching to reinforce Caesar, suddenly declared themselves for the rebellion, massacred the Roman officers accompanying them, and prepared to attack Caesar's rear. Only a swift and decisive intervention by Caesar, who rode out with 4 legions in a forced march, managed to confront the Aedui and bring them back into the fold, their loyalty now paper-thin and utterly unreliable. The news of the Aeduan betrayal, though temporarily averted, spread to the main camp at Gergovia. The situation was becoming untenable. His supply lines were threatened, his allies were on the verge of deserting him, and Vercingetorix's position on the mountain remained as strong as ever. Caesar knew he could not remain. He had to break off the siege and reunite with Labanus's legions to the north before the entire province erupted behind him.
But Caesar could not simply retreat. To do so would be seen as a sign of weakness, an admission of defeat that would embolden every tribe in Gaul. He needed to bloody the enemy, to stage a demonstration of force before he withdrew. He devised a plan for a limited assault, a feint designed to draw the Gauls out of their prepared positions. The plan was complex, relying on timing and discipline. One legion would make a demonstration in one area, while the main assault force would secretly move up a different wooded slope. Their objective was not to take the city itself, but to seize and dismantle the outer Gallic rampart on the slopes below the town walls, then conduct an orderly withdrawal. Caesar gave his commanders explicit, repeated orders. The trumpets would sound the retreat, and at that signal, the men were to pull back immediately. The initial phase of the attack was a stunning success. The legionnaires surged up the slopes, catching the defenders by surprise. They swarmed over the outer wall, sending the Gauls fleeing in panic back toward the main gates of Gergovia. The objective was achieved. The Roman soldiers stood victorious on the captured rampart. But then, something went terribly wrong. In the chaos and exhilaration of the moment, with the enemy in full flight before them and the walls of the city tantalizingly close, the soldiers were overcome by a rush of bloodlust and ambition. They heard the shouts of their comrades, the screams of the fleeing enemy, and they saw what they believed was the chance for a legendary victory. They did not hear the retreat trumpets, or if they did, they ignored them. Driven by the memory of the easy slaughter at Avaricum, believing the city was theirs for the taking, the legionnaires broke discipline. They surged past the captured rampart and began a mad, unsupported scramble up the steep slope toward the main walls of Gergovia. It was a catastrophic error. Vercingetorix, seeing the Romans overextend themselves, coolly dispatched massive reinforcements. The fleeing Gauls turned and stood their ground. Thousands of warriors poured out of the city gates and swarmed down the slopes. The Romans, exhausted from their climb, their formations broken, were suddenly engulfed. The attack dissolved into a series of desperate, isolated struggles for survival. Men were cut down, overwhelmed by numbers. Centurions, the heart and soul of the legion, sacrificed themselves in heroic but futile attempts to form a rear guard. One of them, Marcus Petronius, finding himself surrounded, shouted to his men, "Since I have brought you into this danger, I will at least save you." He charged into the thick of the enemy, killing two and driving the rest back, before being cut down. Another, Lucas Fabius, was killed trying to be the first man on the wall, his body thrown back down onto his comrades. Caesar, watching in horror from the low ground, was forced to commit his reserve forces, including the veteran 10th Legion, not to press the attack, but to desperately try to cover the chaotic, bloody retreat of his broken legions. The 10th formed a solid line, a bastion of discipline in a sea of chaos, allowing the survivors to stream past them and back to the safety of the Roman camp. The battle was over. It was a disaster. Caesar had lost nearly 700 men, including 46 of his invaluable centurions. It was the single greatest number of officers he had ever lost in one engagement. The next day, he drew up his legions in battle formation, challenging Vercingetorix to come down and fight on the plain. The Gallic chieftain, wisely, refused to give up his advantage. There was nothing left for Caesar to do. He had been outgeneraled, and his own men's indiscipline had led to a bloody repulse. For the first time in the Gallic wars, Caesar had suffered a clear, undeniable, and humiliating defeat. He gathered his battered army and began the long, somber march north. His aura of invincibility was shattered, and the rebellion, now infused with the scent of Roman blood, burned hotter than ever.
Defeat has a sound, and in the summer of 52 BC, it was the sound of silence in the Roman camp. It was the quiet shame of the legionaries who had broken discipline, the grim contemplation of the surviving centurions, and the cold, calculating fury of their commander. But outside the Roman lines, defeat had a very different sound. It was the sound of a wildfire catching on dry grass. The news of Gergovia, the story of Caesar's legions broken and bleeding at the foot of a Gallic mountain, did not just spread, it exploded across the land. It was the spark that ignited the entire nation of Gaul. For years, Caesar had masterfully exploited the divisions between the Gallic tribes. He had used their ancient rivalries, their jealousies, their petty squabbles to keep them weak and isolated. But the victory at Gergovia changed everything. It was a symbol, a potent demonstration that the Romans were not gods. They could be beaten. They could be made to bleed. The architect of this victory, Vercingetorix, was no longer just a chieftain of the Arverni. He was transformed into a figure of prophecy, the living embodiment of Gallic defiance. The first and most critical domino to fall was the Aedui. For generations, they had been brothers and kinsmen of the Roman people, their alliance the bedrock of Roman influence in Gaul. They had provided Caesar with cavalry, supplies, and legitimacy, but their loyalty, already strained to the breaking point, now snapped. The same leaders who had sworn renewed allegiance to Caesar just weeks before now openly declared for the rebellion. At their capital of Bibracte, they convened a grand council of all Gaul. Tribe after tribe, from the Atlantic coast to the forests of the Ardennes, sent their chieftains. Old enemies stood side by side, their personal feuds forgotten in the face of a common, hated enemy. In a moment of unprecedented unity, the council formally deposed the previous commander-in-chief of the allied Gallic forces, and, by unanimous consent, bestowed the supreme command upon Vercingetorix. It was a revolutionary moment. For the first time in its history, the fiercely independent, fractious nation of Gaul was united under a single military leader, with a single purpose: to drive the Romans from their land forever. The strategic situation for Caesar had become a nightmare. He was deep in hostile territory, cut off from his northern legions under Labienus, and completely isolated from the Roman province in the south. The entire country had risen up around him. Bridges were broken, supply convoys were ambushed, and Roman citizens, merchants and traders living in Gallic towns were hunted down and massacred. The town of Cenabum, modern-day Orleans, erupted in a frenzy of violence, slaughtering the Roman businessmen who lived there. The rebellion was no longer just a military campaign. It was a popular uprising, fueled by years of accumulated rage and humiliation. Vercingetorix, now at the head of a colossal army drawn from across the nation, did not rest on his laurels. He dispatched forces in all directions. He sent an army south to invade the Roman province of Transalpine Gaul itself, threatening the very foundation of Roman power in the region. He sent another to attack the Allobroges, another key Roman ally. His strategy was to create chaos everywhere, to force Caesar to splinter his forces, to surround him and cut him off from any hope of reinforcement or escape. The weight of command was now immense. Vercingetorix was no longer just a guerrilla leader. He was the general of a nation in arms, responsible for coordinating the movements of tens of thousands of men across a vast theater of war. He demanded hostages from every allied tribe to ensure their loyalty, and he levied huge quotas of soldiers and cavalry. He ruled with an iron hand, understanding that this fragile unity could only be maintained through absolute discipline.
Minor offenses were punished with mutilation, serious crimes with death by fire. He was forging a nation through fear and fervor, demanding a level of sacrifice and obedience that was utterly alien to the Gallic spirit of individualism. Caesar, meanwhile, was forced into a desperate gamble. His first priority was to reunite his army. He began a hard, fast march north, his legions moving through hostile country, their senses on high alert. He successfully linked up with Labienus, who had fought his own difficult campaign near Paris and was extricating his 4 legions with brilliant skill. The Roman army was whole again. 10 legions, a force of nearly 50,000 battle-hardened veterans. But they were an island of Roman steel in a vast and raging Gallic sea. The air itself seemed to crackle with tension. The fate of Gaul, and with it Caesar's entire career and life, hung in the balance. Vercingetorix, his confidence soaring, his cavalry numbering in the tens of thousands, made a fateful decision. He would not let Caesar escape. He would confront the Roman army on the march and destroy it in the open. The time for scorched earth and guerrilla tactics was over, he believed. The time had come for a final, decisive battle to annihilate the Roman presence in Gaul once and for all. The greatest army Rome had ever put in the field was now cornered, and the largest army Gaul had ever assembled was closing in for the kill. The stage was being set for the final cataclysmic confrontation. Vercingetorix, supreme commander of a united Gaul, made his move. He shadowed Caesar's legions as they marched east, seeking a path back to the Roman province. Near modern-day Dijon, he decided the moment was right. He gathered his massive force of cavalry, the pride of the Gaul army, and threw it at the Roman column. His plan was to shatter the Roman formation, to halt their march and pin them down, allowing his infantry to move in and complete the annihilation. He made his cavalrymen swear a sacred oath that none would return to his family or his home unless he had ridden through the Roman line of battle twice. The attack came like a thunderclap. Thousands of Gallic horsemen crashed against the Roman legions, but Caesar was prepared. He had anticipated the attack. He had spent the previous weeks recruiting his own cavalry, not from Gaul, but from the fierce Germanic tribes across the Rhine. These were mercenaries, fighting not for loyalty but for pay, and they were superb horsemen. As the Gallic cavalry swirled around the steadfast Roman infantry, Caesar unleashed his German squadrons. The clash was brutal and decisive. The Germans, fighting with a savage fury, smashed into the flank of the Gallic charge. The elite Arvernian cavalry, Vercingetorix's own men, were broken. The rest of the Gallic cavalry, seeing their finest warriors routed, lost their nerve. The charge faltered, then dissolved into a full-blown panic. The hunters had become the hunted. The great Gallic cavalry attack, which was meant to be the decisive blow, had ended in a disastrous rout. In that single failed cavalry charge, the strategic situation was reversed with shocking speed. Vercingetorix, his grand plan in ruins, and his cavalry scattered, was suddenly vulnerable. He had lost his mobile striking force and was now left with his massive but less flexible infantry army. Panicked, he made a decision that would seal his fate and the fate of Gaul. He ordered a full retreat to the nearest defensible position, the hilltop fortress, or oppidum, of Alesia. Alesia was a formidable stronghold, perched on a high plateau with steep river valleys on two sides, a perfect place to withstand a siege. Vercingetorix gathered his remaining army, some 80,000 warriors, within its walls. He had ample provisions, he believed, to last for at least a month. His plan was simple. He would hold out in his impregnable fortress while the full might of the Gallic rebellion, a massive relief army was summoned from every corner of the nation to surround and destroy the Romans. He would trap the trapper. But he had fatally underestimated the man he was facing. Caesar, arriving at Alesia and seeing Vercingetorix's army bottled up, did not see a difficult siege ahead. He saw the ultimate opportunity. He had his enemy exactly where he wanted him, concentrated in a single, fixed location. He would not just besiege Alesia, he would entomb it. He gathered his commanders and laid out a plan of such breathtaking scale and audacity that it bordered on madness. He would build 2 lines of fortifications, one facing inwards to pin Vercingetorix.
The great iron ring was closed. Inside the walls of Alesia, a city built for thousands now held a population swollen by an army of 80,000 warriors. At first, there might have been a sense of confidence, of defiance. Vercingetorix had sent his summons. The relief army was coming. All they had to do was wait. The days ticked by. The Roman lines, a silent, menacing scar on the landscape, remained unbroken. The legionaries were a constant, disciplined presence, their sentries pacing the ramparts, their work parties strengthening the fortifications, their patrols moving through the deadly maze of pits and stakes. Then, the first quiet pangs of a new enemy began to be felt. This was an enemy that could not be fought with a sword or a spear. It was an enemy that crept into the city not over the walls, but from within each man, woman, and child. It was hunger. The provisions Vercingetorix had believed to be ample were being consumed at a terrifying rate. The grain stores, meant to feed the city's normal population, were being devoured by a massive, idle army. Rations were cut. Then they were cut again. The gnawing emptiness in the stomach became a constant companion, a dull ache that soon sharpened into a painful, cramping agony. The confident talk in the streets and barracks quieted, replaced by the low murmurs of worried men. The children were the first to cry from the pain. Days bled into weeks. The hope that had sustained them began to curdle into a sickling dread. From the high walls of the fortress, they could see the vast, empty plains beyond the Roman lines. Where was the relief army? Had the summons failed? Had the tribes of Gaul abandoned them? The psychological pressure was immense. They were trapped in a cage, watching their captors methodically prepare for their destruction, while the life slowly drained out of them. The hunger began to change people. It stripped away the veneer of civilization, of camaraderie. Fights broke out over scraps of food. The weak were preyed upon by the strong. The city, once a proud bastion of Gallic power, began to resemble a vast open-air prison, its inhabitants slowly descending into a state of animal desperation. The bodies of those who died from starvation or sickness were buried in shallow graves, the living too weak to dig any deeper. The stench of death began to hang in the air. Finally, a council of the Gallic chieftains was convened. The situation was desperate. One of the leaders, Critognatus, a chieftain of the Averni, rose to speak. What he proposed was a measure of the absolute horror to which they had been reduced. He spoke with a cold, terrifying logic. He reminded them of their ancestors, who, when besieged by the Cimbri and Teutonus, had sustained themselves by eating the bodies of those deemed useless for war. He argued that surrender was unthinkable. It meant a life of slavery and degradation. To sally forth and attack the Roman lines in their weakened state was suicide. Their only hope, he argued, was to hold out until the relief army arrived, and to do that they must eat. He proposed that they take the women, the children, the elderly, all those who could not fight, and use their bodies as food to keep the warriors alive. It was a monstrous, pragmatic horror, a glimpse into the abyss. The other chieftains, though horrified, did not have him executed for the suggestion. They debated it. This was the depth of their despair. In the end, they could not bring themselves to commit to cannibalism, but they settled on a solution only marginally less cruel. They would expel the non-combatants from the city. All the ordinary citizens of Alesia, the men too old to fight, the women, the children, were gathered together. They were driven from their homes, their faces etched with terror and confusion. They were herded to the city gates, which were open just long enough to force them out. A great tragic procession of thousands of people stumbled out of Alesia and towards the Roman lines. They were not an army. They were a crowd of ghosts, their bodies emaciated, their eyes hollow with despair. They shuffled across the no-man's land, the ground between the city walls and the first of Caesar's fortifications. They reached the Roman trenches, and they begged. They pleaded to be taken in, to be accepted as slaves, anything to be given a crust of bread, a sip of water. They held up their starving children, their faces streaked with tears, hoping to inspire some flicker of pity in the hearts of the Roman soldiers watching from the ramparts. Caesar's response was as cold and as absolute as the fortifications he had built. He had calculated his own supplies down to the last bushel of grain. He could not and would not feed thousands of enemy civilians. To do so would jeopardize his entire campaign. He issued a single, brutal order. No one was to be allowed through the lines. The legionaries stood on their walls, their faces like stone, and did nothing. The pleas of the starving people went unanswered. They were trapped. The gates of Alesia, their home, were closed to them. The Roman lines were an impenetrable barrier. They were left to die in the open, in the narrow strip of land between the two armies. For days, the warriors on the walls of Alesia and the Roman soldiers on their ramparts were forced to watch the horror unfold. They watched as the children stopped crying and fell silent. They watched as people lay down on the cold ground and did not get up again. They watched as a whole population slowly, agonizingly starved to death. It was an act of calculated psychological cruelty on a scale that was almost unimaginable. Caesar was demonstrating to the men inside Alesia the price of their defiance. He was showing them the fate that awaited them. He was using the bodies of their own families to break their will. The ring of fortifications had become a ring of starvation, and at its heart lay a graveyard where an entire city was dying.
Just as the last vestiges of hope were dying within the starved city of Alesia, a new sound reached the ears of the besieged and the besiegers alike. It began as a low rumble on the horizon, a vibration felt in the soles of the feet. Then it grew into a roar, the sound of a nation on the march. The Gallic relief army had finally arrived. It was a staggering sight, a biblical flood of humanity pouring over the surrounding hills. 250,000 men, according to Caesar's own account, drawn from every corner of Gaul, a coalition of tribes united by a single purpose, to crush the Roman army and liberate their trapped countrymen. They were led by the chieftains Commius and Vercassivellaunus, Vercingetorix's own cousin. They established a massive camp on the hills a mile from the Roman lines, their campfires at night turning the entire horizon into a sea of flickering lights. The trap was now set. Caesar's 50,000 men were now caught precisely as he had planned, in the middle, between two massive enemy armies. The psychological pressure was almost unbearable. The starving warriors inside Alesia, their spirits suddenly revived, let out a great cheer. They began to prepare for battle, bringing forth ladders and grappling hooks, ready to storm the inner Roman wall. The Romans, standing on their ramparts, looked one way and saw 80,000 desperate men preparing to break out. They looked the other way and saw 250,000 fresh troops preparing to break in. They were outnumbered 6-1, a tiny island in a raging ocean of Gallic fury. There was no retreat. There was no surrender. There was only victory or annihilation. The first assault came the next day.
The Gallic relief army surged forward, a great wave of warriors, their cavalry sweeping across the plain, their infantry advancing behind. They crashed against Caesar's outer fortifications. At the same time, a roar went up from Alesia, and Vercingetorix's men poured out of the city, attempting to fill the Roman trenches and storm the inner wall. The battle had begun on two fronts simultaneously. The Roman defensive system, that nightmarish landscape of pits and stakes, now revealed its horrific purpose. The Gallic charge dissolved into chaos and agony. Men and horses were impaled on the hidden stakes, their legs broken in the lilies, their feet pierced by the iron caltrops. The Roman legionaries, protected by their ramparts, rained down a merciless torrent of javelins, arrows, and heavy stones from their catapults. The first attack was repulsed, a bloody failure. The Gauls regrouped. They spent the next day preparing, making fascines, great bundles of sticks to fill the trenches and ladders to scale the walls. That night they attacked again, under the cover of darkness. The fighting was desperate, a chaotic, terrifying affair, lit by the flicker of torches and the flash of steel. The screams of the wounded and dying filled the night air. Again, the Roman lines held. The discipline of the legions, their experience and superior engineering was proving decisive. But the Gallic commanders had identified a weakness. To the north of the Roman position, there was a large hill that, due to its size and difficult terrain, Caesar had been unable to include within his main fortified ring. His men had built a separate camp there, defended by 2 legions, but it was a potential vulnerability. The Gallic plan was to launch a massive, coordinated assault. The main Gallic army would attack the outer wall from all sides to pin down the majority of Caesar's forces. At the same time, a hand-picked force of 60,000 elite warriors, led by Vercassivalaunus, Vercingetorix's own cousin, would march through the night, circle around, and attack the weak point at the northern camp. Vercingetorix, watching from Alesia, would launch his own all-out assault on the inner wall at the exact same moment. It was a brilliant, complex plan designed to overwhelm the Romans from every direction at once. The final battle began at midday. A great roar went up from all sides. The Gallic army surged forward, crashing against the outer fortifications. From within, Vercingetorix's men stormed the inner lines, and to the north, the 60,000 elite warriors of Vercassivalaunus descended from the hills and smashed into the isolated Roman camp. The fighting there was the most desperate of all. The 2 Roman legions were being overwhelmed, their defenses buckling under the sheer weight of numbers. The Gauls were pouring over the ramparts. The line was about to break. Caesar, watching the entire battle unfold from a high command post, saw the crisis. The entire fate of the war now rested on this single, failing sector. He dispatched his trusted lieutenant Libanius with reinforcements, telling him to hold the line if possible, but if it was about to collapse, to sally forth and fight in the open. But it was not enough. The pressure was too great. The moment of ultimate crisis had arrived. And in that moment, Caesar acted. He gathered his personal bodyguard and a few remaining cohorts and rode towards the sound of the fighting. He had taken off his commander's helmet so that his men could see his face. He wore his brilliant scarlet cloak, the paludamentum, making him an unmissable target, a flash of red in the sea of chaos. His men, on the verge of breaking, saw him coming. They saw their general, the man they had followed for 8 years, the man who had eaten their bread and slept on their ground, riding not to the rear, but into the thickest, most desperate part of the battle. A great shout went up from the Roman ranks. Their morale, which had been about to shatter, suddenly solidified into a core of iron resolve. They saw Caesar's German cavalry, which he had also committed, smashing into the rear of the Gallic attack. The tide of the battle turned in a single, breathtaking instant. The Gauls, who had been on the verge of victory, suddenly found themselves attacked from the front and the rear. They saw the scarlet cloak of the Roman general in their midst, and they panicked. The elite Gallic force, the 60,000 chosen men, broke and fled. The rout was total. The Roman cavalry, merciless and swift, hunted them down as they ran. Their Singivalaunus himself was captured. The main relief army, seeing the disaster to the north, lost heart and began to disintegrate. The battle was over. The greatest army Gaul had ever assembled was not just defeated, it was annihilated. Inside Alasia, Vercingetorix and his men heard the cheers from the Roman lines and saw the rout of their countrymen. They knew that all was lost.